everybody. I'm really excited to bring on a special guest today, but first, let me give some personal background. I went on a trip to Curacao not too long ago, and before I left for my birthday, I was given a book, which I'm sure you've all heard of, Let That Shit Go. I was so inspired by that book, not just because it helped me slow down and gave fantastic tips on how to grow, organize your thoughts, forgive, and be more productive, but on how companies and corporations are starting to focus more on employee mental health as an element of CSR. I thought, who better to discuss this than the international bestseller author herself, Nina Purewal? And I really made it happen. So, Nina, thank you so much for joining. Please introduce yourself, give me a little background of your life, your passions, and whatever else you want to share.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so honored to be on this podcast, and I love that the book made its way to Carousel and back. I've been there, and it's really neat to hear, when people are on vacation reading it. I feel so grateful that you read it and you got something out of it. It's 120 tips on how to find more happiness and peace in the everyday. And we tried to make it really practical for people of how to implement, ancient wisdom. So my name is Nina, as you know. I founded the company Pure Minds Inc., and I do mostly corporate wellness workshops. I've got about 10 different workshops on things like women empowerment, on navigating imposter syndrome, on shifting our perspective, on finding tech zen. Over 90% of people in corporations are stressed out. So I work on stress mitigation, what to do with anxiety, and I try to make mindfulness super practical in the workspace. As you know, I've got this book, and I'm also an executive grief ambassador for the Season Center for Grieving Children, because I've gone through a lot of loss in my life and a lot of trauma. And I went to the Season Center back in 1997. And now, I work with them to help drive awareness with the work they do. There's been a lot of kids, especially since the pandemic, that have lost parents to addiction or suicide. And so it's just a natural passion of mine to talk about grief as well.
Okay, I love it. It's such a taboo topic, and it can make people really uncomfortable. And I love that in this generation we're having a little bit more, what they say, comfort with being uncomfortable. So I love that you're bringing light to that. And I saw your LinkedIn post not too long ago with your workshop on Liberty Mutual, that you closed it and you ended off with your story. You can choose if you want to talk about that, but I know that it was hard, and I wonder, what that buildup was like and how the audience reacted.
That's a great question. So just to give people background, I'm happy to talk about my story, and I talk about it in the book. And obviously, it's taken a while to be this vulnerable. It's taken a lot of therapy to get to this point. But I of the mind of, if you can get to a place where you can share and there's some impact, that's a bigger gift to me than anything really. So that's why, I share. But the story is that the long and short of it is, when I was 16, I lost my dad and brother to a murder suicide. And, that came out of, my parents were in a very abusive relationship. My dad was abusive towards my mom. My mom, after 20 years, finally served him with divorce papers. He couldn't handle it. And his premeditated plan was actually to take me as well and leave her with nothing. As luck should have it, I out of the house, and I'm grateful every day just to be alive. But in sharing that story, I typically don't go into that much detail when I talk to companies, and I've worked with over 60 companies now with my new job, and I came from corporate. But specifically, Liberty Mutual wanted me to close AAPI month and mental health month, and they wanted me to open up with my story. And so I was nervous as shit. Like, I have never been that nervous opening. I said in the post, I felt like the 600 people online could probably hear my heartbeat through the microphone. So yeah, it takes a ton of vulnerability, and it took some courage, but it landed extremely well. I mean, there was pin drop silence. Even in hindsight, I got feedback, and there were people, in tears, and, texting people who were there live and saying this just opened up a whole platform. And I speak on vulnerability and authenticity, and I feel like the best way to receive it back is to put it out. And so I'm like, if I'm asking everybody to do this, then I have to do it of myself and be the example. And it's amazing what happens when I start sharing. And then I'd say the biggest, most impactful thing is when leaders start sharing. Everybody suddenly feels like, oh, you're struggling with mental health. Oh, you get anxiety. Oh, you're the VP and you have imposter syndrome. You've struggled with trauma in your life, and suddenly it just creates this humanization within a corporation, that we're all not robots. We're all here with our own stories.
I love it. That is so great. So I guess that was probably a huge contributor to writing your book, your story, your climbing up the corporate ladder, your trauma. But if you had to, I guess, narrow it down, what inspired you to write this book? What are the core things, and what are some core themes that you hope readers take away from it? Maybe your
It's
favorite tips.
favorite tips. It's so funny, Athena, because I tell high school students that I never intended to write a book. I failed high school English. It all trauma. So I kind of went from a straight A student to like barely, being able to concentrate in class. But I'm a math numbers person. I'm a data geek. Like I'm not a writer by any means. And this book actually landed in my lap when I started following my passion. So it's another nod to like when you feel like you're on the path to do something, when the universe puts you here to do what you're meant to do, when you start doing that thing, it's incredible the things that start falling into place. So that's a story in itself. Basically, in a nutshell, Kate and I, who was my co-author, were doing workshops in Toronto around mindfulness and meditation, and they went viral because she had this funny idea to add swearing, like the whole AF, like mindful was like big then. This was, I'm talking 6-7 years ago. Viral, and our publisher HarperCollins caught wind of them, and they're like, "We love how you're positioning this. Would you be open to writing a book?" We had 9 weeks to write the book, and I can't believe how much actually came out of me as I wrote. But I would say that the most important things, I'd say for people who identify as women and for me personally, were awareness, being aware of what's going on in our minds, because we think on average 60,000 thoughts a day, and 80% of them are said to be negative or self-deprecating, hence imposter syndrome. So how to be aware of our thoughts. The second chapter is all about self-love. And to me, self-love, yes, it's going to the spa, it's spending time with girlfriends, the outward things, but self-love begins with, what are you actually saying to yourself? If every time you approach a task or a relationship and your lead thought is, I'm not good enough, which is very common from childhood, you're not showing up as your best self, you're not attracting the good things. How do we start being aware of the dialogue and then changing the dialogue? And then I would say authenticity is another big one, especially as it pertains to the corporate space. It was the word of the year last year. People are just trying to be more authentic. And it, when I started in the corporate space 20 years ago, it was not like that. We all walked in as robots. Like if shit was happening at home, you just paint a smile on your face and you'd be like, everything's fine. But now we don't have to share our deepest and darkest with our colleagues, but at least be able to say, like, shit's going on at home and I can't focus. Like I need a day. We should be able to have that transparent conversation with our manager, especially as we all took work home in the pandemic. Now it's like, okay, yeah, we're bringing personal into work, and that should be okay. You wanted us to integrate it that way. We can integrate it this way too. And I feel like most leaders are, open to this and realizing there's a huge space to work in this now, that we have to start talking about mental health. We have to start talking about wellness.
Yeah, it's so important. I feel like most of my internships, they haven't really been corporate related. So when I actually, enter that field, I feel like it's going to be a whole, I feel like it's going to be a whole different world. But then when I hear this, there's a talk about mental health and it's becoming more normalized, I'm like, will it be so different? So it's like, I kind of have yet to find out. Because I'm a university right now and it's super, super open. We have workshops, we have clubs, we have yoga at 6 in the morning and at 8 p.m. Like we have all of these resources to keep us, sane, because it's not easy to be a full-time student. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. And I would say two things for that. One is, if that's important to you, make sure that in your interview process, you're interviewing the company as much as they're interviewing you. So you want to make sure, if you have certain standards that you want to live by, values that you want to adhere to, that the company that you're going to be working for is also aligned with that. It's hard a little bit to tell in the interview process, so maybe even finding people on LinkedIn who work for that company and be like, hey, are they really into wellness? Do they have yoga options? Do they have, a budget for therapy or mental health? And then the second thing I would say is own it, girl, because so much of Gen Z is coming in hot into the corporate space and been like, we're not doing that. Like, I'm not, and I'm all about this movement of like having younger mentors. And I was always of the mind of like hire people smarter than me. But I think Gen Z is coming in with a perspective of life
Mhm.
where work is, and this is something I try to educate people on is like work is not the center of your life. It's a piece of your pie. It's a piece of your puzzle.
Mm.
And I feel like Gen Z has that perspective. So I think, my advice too is to, instead of kind of fear what corporations look like, be an advocate for the change and go in, and they're coming in unapologetically and being
Mhm.
like, how much vacation do I get? How much do you focus on mental health and wellness? Like these were questions I dared not ask when I was interviewing
Right.
in three. Um, so I think, yes, there might be a little like apprehension there, but also I think, own it and step into it. And I think it'll do people favors, and it's going to be what changes the face of corporations.
I love it. That's so many great tips right there. I think that one of my favorite tips from your book might have been the fact that like happiness comes within. Happiness is like a whole bunch of practices that you need to implement, and it's found within. And there was a line, and it was funny to me because it was like you don't need to be on the beach with a book in one hand and a drink in the other to be happy. And I was like, but I'm on an island, and I had that experience. I like read that in the island. I was like, haha, like I'm so silly.
I know that was a bit intentional because we figured people would take it on vacation to read, but
Oh, really?
you can be out of this space and still be happy. You don't need to be
Yeah,
sitting oceanfront. I know exactly the line you're talking about.
it's true.
And yeah, I think that's the magic. So just for some background, about a decade into my career, I hit a peak point of stress. I was like addicted to my crackberry. That's what they called blackberries at the time.
Oh,
You're like, what is that? Everybody had, no one had, this is before iPhones came out. And I was emailing like all hours of the night kind of thing. And suddenly I'm like, what is life all about? Like, what is my purpose? What am I doing? And I'd gone through all this trauma, and I repressed and suppressed. That's a whole other topic we can talk about, but I didn't really deal with my emotions. I just got myself into my career, and then I hit a peak point of stress. Because yeah, if you don't acknowledge the shit and you keep doing this, eventually you're gonna snap.
mhm,
And so I took a year off, and I lived in a monastery, or I lived in an ashram for an entire year. Uh,
mhm,
and when I came out of that, I realized the one nugget about ancient wisdom that is so incredibly empowering is that we are happiness.
mhm,
Our true nature is joy and bliss and love. And if you think of yourself as an infant or a toddler, your inherent nature, you were inherently happy. You didn't have all these emotional things. Somewhere along the lines, when we were, around 5, 6 years old, people started saying shit to us that made us believe that, oh, we're not good enough, or we're not as good as our sibling, or maybe we, don't deserve X, Y, and Z. But it's going back to that, our true nature. So when people say, oh, I'm on a journey to find happiness, I always say it's already there.
mhm,
The journey is letting go of all the shit in the way
mhm.
that's blocking us from seeing that we are true happiness. And the analogy that was used at the ashram was like, if you think of the sun on a really cloudy day and it's dreary and it's cold and it's wet and it's puddly outside, you have no access to the sun rays, but the sun is still there.
Mhm.
The sun hasn't gone anywhere. So in that way, our true nature, it's always happiness. We just sometimes can't access it and every chapter is another cloud obstructing our happiness, whether it's lack of self-love, lack of authenticity, lack of acceptance, lack of perspective, lack of forgiveness. And once we start embodying all these things and own them and move through them, we can start seeing that sun and feeling it, shine from within, because we're constantly looking for happiness in the external.
Mhm.
In trips and houses and relationships, and those things bring happiness, but they also bring a number of other negative emotions, right? Like relationships, you sometimes love them to pieces and then you can't stand them, and you buy the house and now you have to furnish it and you have bills. Like, so if you look externally, you're not going to tap into that permanent bliss. It's going to be temporary flicks of happiness and joy, and then stress and anxiety, right? So leaning in is so important.
I love it. Okay. So I love that really that was only one or two questions and that took so much time. There's so much depth, there's so much truth,
There's
there's so
so
much
much stuff. Okay, I'll work on shortening my answers.
no, not at all. I just mean that it's real and I love it. And
It's
I'm
all
so happy.
connected. Yeah.
Exactly. So I guess another question is your book emphasizes mindfulness and well-being. So how do you see these concepts integrated into the corporate world, especially in the context of corporate social responsibility?
Yeah, I've always been a huge advocate of corporate social responsibility. Like I've always been on the teams and done the thing, and I was put on global projects like in my corporate space because of my passion for that. And now I think, especially since the pandemic, we're in a mental health crisis. I know in Canada, depression and anxiety is on the rise.
Mhm.
Um, it's on the rise in the US as well. Suicide rates are like, it's just, we're at a crisis. And I think it's only in the best interest of companies to understand, what's going on. And I just spoke to a very senior VP and he said there's trauma in the workplace right now, right? So getting to the bottom of what's, of what's contributing to this, and then also giving people tools on how to mitigate stress, how to mitigate, whether that's boundaries that they need to put in place or just like breathing techniques, mindfulness can really play into focus, into efficiency, into productivity, which is important, but also your overall happiness. So I think more and more companies more and more employees are wanting to see this of their companies, and more companies, from what I've seen, especially like I said, post-pandemic, are stepping up to the plate and having a budget for wellness and mental health, which I think is critical right now.
Okay, that's so good. Okay, well, you mentioned, a senior VP who was talking about mental health crisis, and I guess one of my next questions is, how does the concept of ethical leadership in your book align with the principles of corporate social responsibility?
I think it's everything. And when I worked for Cadbury before they were acquired by Kraft, and I still remember this. Our global CEO had 6 objectives that were business related and 6 objectives that were CSR related.
Mm.
So he was literally evaluated against, how do I better serve this world and serve this company? And that was very uncommon, like in the mid 2000s. So I think, when we talk about ethical leadership, it goes hand in hand with like, social responsibility and how leaders should show up. And I think 10 years ago, it was about, what are we doing for the world? What are we doing for climate change? What are we doing for pay equity? What are we doing for social injustice? And now it's a bit like, hang on, let's keep doing these things for people, but what are you actually doing for me? Like, I'm about to have a mental breakdown. Um, and so I think the shift to wellness and mental health is like focusing on the individual. And I think there are leaders out there who are recognizing that, this is an area that we need to focus on. And sometimes it's company based, like a company will have an objective. Sometimes it's just leadership based. And that's where I always emphasize, I do leadership workshops, I do executive team workshops, that the power really lies in your hands. If
Mhm.
you are a leader that cares about this, it'll show. People will feel vulnerable. You'll create a psychologically safe space. And that's all part of corporate social responsibility. You spend more time at work than you do with your family.
Mhm.
And it's important to create a safe space for people.
Yeah, it's really important. I think one of the or one example that always comes to my mind when I think of like really unethical leadership was one that I learned about in a Forbes 30 under 30 video. I remember I was going through a phase where I was like watching all these Forbes 30 under 30 like 2-minute videos like about their life, day in my life, here's my company, whatever. And I don't remember the name, but there was a lady who she started a business for maybe like designer um suitcases or very aesthetic suitcases, like some kind of niche, product like that. And I was like, oh, cool, that's so interesting. I'm gonna like read more about her just for the heck of it. And then I came across this article talking about how she was such a terrible leader. Like not only terrible in the sense that like she was mean, but she would like kind of degrade her employees since it was a small company. It was a team of like maybe 5 or 6 people. They were all overworked. They came to her saying, we're stressed. We've been working whatever 50, 60 hours a week. And she would put them in these uncomfortable situations, not just because she would be like, I need this done by a certain time, but because she would say something like, guys, if you guys, I know it's whatever, the week of Christmas and New Year's, but if you work this week for me, I'll give you a bonus of however much. And it was so uncomfortable for them because it was a big bonus. But they were like, well, I really don't want to do this, obviously, but how am I supposed to deny this at the same time? That in itself, like that offer, providing an offer that they can't deny, but it's also so uncomfortable, is, I feel like, an example of unethical leadership.
Absolutely.
And there was totally a compromise on their mental health.
Yeah.
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 I
Absolutely.
want, oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to say it's really hard when you see this dichotomy of like
Mhm.
leaders being like, rah, rah, mental health, wellness, it's all important, but then their
Mhm.
actions show differently. And that's why I'm constantly on the leaders to say, like, you can check the mental wellness box by bringing me in and having a workshop, but like, how are you actually showing up
Right.
for your team? And I think it requires a lot of being in tune with your team and being aware of like who they are outside of work. You know, when I was in my last leadership role, I made it a point every quarter I'd meet with my members of my team one-on-one, and I'm like, this is not about work. How are you doing? How are you feeling? How are your kids? What's going on? Are you happy with where you are? Do you want to be at another function? Da, da, da. Like talking about all the things, just so I had just so I had a pulse on like who are they outside of work and are they okay?
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, there's some leaders that talk the talk, and then there's some leaders, and they talk the talk. There's some leaders that walk the walk, and there's some that just like do the check box. But it's
Mhm.
becoming harder and harder, especially with Gen Z coming in,
Mhm.
to sit in that duality because you'll be called out on your bullshit
So quick,
time.
so fast. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, kind of bringing that same concept like back into the university life, into like my I guess my college classes. There's only one professor who has actually sat us down at the end of the semester one on one and been like, so what would you rate me? Like, how was I? Do you think that I was fair? How's your mental health? And he did it. I mean, granted, it was a class of maybe like 20 to 25 students. It's obviously harder if you have like a seminar style class of 300 or 400, but you could still send out a survey, a brief 2-minute mental health survey, anonymous, something like that. And he was just a fantastic professor on the side note. I really loved him. He was so vibrant. Like
Yeah.
I would have all of my 5 classes Tuesday and Thursdays, and I would end off with his 9 to like, basically 5 p.m. back to back. And it was the best way that I could end off because he was always so happy
Yeah.
and he cared about his students. He cared about his students so much. So I know that a lot of professors care, but they don't take that extra step to see how everyone is really doing. How's everyone coping? Is there a reason that they're not maybe thriving academically the way that they could be? How's their mental health? So I would love to see that more.
I think it's important. I think it's important that, I love that this professor has done this. And, it's kind of an ego thing. Like it's good to have fees. Sometimes like I don't want to hear, but when we understand and we look for continuous improvement, it's only going to make us better. Like I love getting feedback surveys from my workshops to be like, okay, where's the constructive feedback? Where was the gap? Da, da, da. Like we can only, improve. And I think there's a really fine line to walk of like confidence and humility. And I think certain leaders can do that right, and be open to that, then, it's just an amazing quality. And I love that this professor like was open to like, how did I do? And da, 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 especially with like professor student relationship. That's even more of like a variance than like employee employer. Because there's a massive age gap and experience gap. But the fact that he's willing to do that, I think that's more and more leaders need to be taking a page out of his book.
Yeah, I think so too. It's really rare. Let's see, which one am I gonna go with next? Okay, I guess I could say, can you share some examples of how mindfulness and well-being practices can lead to tangible social impact within communities? I'm sure you could actually speak on this a lot because of what we're talking about with AAPI.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's so much around mindfulness and the impact to communities, and I would say it kind of starts with you as an individual, because it is a very personal path. But where mindfulness starts is like the awareness
Mm.
of what's going on in there. Because so many of us, especially who work in corporations, are on autopilot. We're just like doing the thing, getting up, getting ready, going to work, doing that, and coming back. And we're not aware of the patterns of maybe how we can be negatively contributing to things. And so once we start becoming more aware of what's going on in there, not only can we impact, ourselves and how we're showing up, but what we're contributing to. And so I think, mindfulness is a really great way to evaluate, am I acting within my values? Like, am I, because as soon as I got real with myself of like, okay, I really like corporate. I love what I do, but I was like, do I really love what I do? Like, so it's a great self-evaluation tool, and to get yourself out of autopilot and into your mind, because we're only aware of less than 1% of our thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And then, once you start getting into the nooks and crannies of what's happening in there and shifting things, like you're showing up as a better person, and times that by everybody in a corporation, everyone's showing up as themselves. Everyone's values are more aligned. Everyone's acting accordingly to their personal code of ethics. I mean, there's so much that can change. And just even in terms of like being more mindful means what triggers you, what kind of people trigger you, you just become so much more intimate with yourself, and then then how you're showing, and then as a result how you're showing up. And like, again, when you bring that into corporations, suddenly people are just operating on a much deeper level. Like the type of camaraderie I see when I walk away. I mean, I've had really senior people get really emotional in workshops and talk about their divorce, or talk about a family member that's dying, or talk about all kinds of things, and suddenly everybody sees each other differently, because we're all sharing a part of our mind space that we didn't feel comfortable sharing before. So there's so much trickle effect and impact to how mindfulness can contribute to a positive society, positive corporations, and like positive self as well.
That's so enlightening. You mentioned something about humility, and it sparked another question in my mind. You in your business for Pure Minds, you do a lot of corporate workshops. Have there been cases where maybe someone on the executive board or someone else for the company kind of checks your work or the content for your workshop and tries to critique you or say, is this really, is this accurate? Is this really necessary? Is this really impacting their mental health? Do they come to you thinking that they know better than you, essentially, even though they're the ones who paid you for your service?
That's a great question. Yes,
Okay.
But I open the door for this because they know their people and they know their corporation better than I do.
Okay.
So this is part of my process, because all of my workshops are customized. I don't do keynotes. I refuse to do keynotes because I don't want to be a talking head. I do workshops because what we talk about is so subtle that I need to ask exercises and questions to people for them to internalize it, right? Like, it's one thing for me to say, oh, watch your imposter syndrome, don't have negative thoughts. It's another thing for me to say, let's now not share, but let's write down our 10 most self-deprecating thoughts and move through it. So it's workshop based, but I've always customized them and have multiple meetings with the company ahead of time to be like, what are your objectives? What is your culture like? What are people going through right now? And then that gives them the space and the permission for them to be like, you know what, this exercise is actually, I don't think it's a good fit. Can we add this to it? Or can you layer this on? They get a full download of exactly what the workshop is going to look like. So this is the humility part, is like, I open it up to say, this is based on what you think. This is what I put together, but let's look at it together and further customize the content. And you tell me, like, if this or this could be more applicable. So I'm the knowledge matter expert when it comes to the mindfulness and all the techniques on removing the cloud, so to speak. But when it comes to how to adapt it to their company, I lean into them, and I'm fully open to them being like, this isn't going to work, this is going to work, this, because it's only going to create like a better workshop. I've come across very few like hardcore naysayers, especially if they're going to hire me. It means they want me, and I have to say that most, majority of people who hire me are people who identify as women. So that's a little thing I'm trying to crack. But yeah, I think it's, I think it's critical for all of us to realize, like, where we are with mental health, and leaders to act accordingly. And if they are critical about something, it's usually because, like, let's make it a better fit for what this team's going through. So I'm kind of open to it.
Okay, good. I love that it's customized, that it's kind of an experience. The experience is going to be different for everyone else. I guess I was kind of thinking more in the context of like anti-bias, anti-racist focused workshops, because I know of a lot of people who they're hired for these workshops so that people can understand like their unconscious bias or what microaggressions are. People are like, actually, mostly obviously white people are like, well, I don't think that. Well, actually, I'm trying to, and I'm like, okay, I just wanted to see if it was the same kind of thing where they think that they know better than the person who is the professional. So that's
I
why.
think it's a good question, and I think there is some sort of false sense of reality of how well people are coping.
Mhm.
It's like because people show up and then we'll do a workshop and some leaders are like, oh my God, I didn't realize like people were struggling with mental health. Like, so I think at the onset, it's like sometimes it's like, yeah, let's do this for the check mark, the wellness thing. And then as we go deeper, they end up hiring me for a series of workshops because we're like, we didn't even realize like our employees were going through this. And, knock on wood, I'm super grateful that like feedback has always been incredibly positive. And so, it's obviously it's resonating, but I think, yeah, leaders sometimes are like, oh no, that's not us. We're fine. We don't have subconscious bias or we don't have people that are struggling. Everyone's performing, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, well, that's why so-and-so is about to snap. And so like is about to take a 6-month long-term mental health leave. And, so opening their eyes to this. And this is something new that leaders didn't have to take on. Like, I think people who identify as men, like executive men, are having a bit of a hard time with it because before it used to be like, hey, here are your objectives, go figure it out. And now it's like, oh, I have to check in and see how they, yes, you do. And so it's been a really interesting, shift in people recognizing, but I think they are, as they do the workshops, as they unpack stuff, they're like, oh shit, there's a need for this.
That's really good. Okay, I hope that this question doesn't come off too repetitive, but I guess what are some common challenges that companies might face when incorporating mindfulness into their CSR efforts? Is it mostly just that, they haven't really done this before, or I've been working here for 40 years and we never discussed this before, or is it, well, I'm kind of uncomfortable talking about this, or is it like a lack of trust? My dad, when I told him I was going to be interviewing you to talk about mental health and mindfulness in the workplace, he was like, oh yeah, we have a therapy resource at the company that I work at, but I don't think a lot of people use it because they're basically scared that maybe the company is going to be keeping tabs on them, or there's going to be some kind of violation of their privacy. Is that one of the main challenges, or what do you think?
There's many challenges, and I started my company in 2017, and I think it's gotten a lot better. We've seen a lot of change, like I said, post-pandemic, more aware of the mental health piece, but challenges run from anywhere from budget, which I call bullshit all the time because they have multi-million-dollar advertising
Yeah.
that money. But sometimes it's like, what financial source do we pull that from? Like, who's paying for it? Is it HR? Is it emergency? So sometimes it's navigating something as simple as that. Sometimes the word mindfulness, if you notice in the book, when we wrote it in 2018, our publisher actually wanted us to write a book on mindfulness and not use the word mindfulness.
Okay.
Yeah, they were like, it's way too intimidating. So you notice we won't use the word until the 8th chapter, which is the reveal of like, by the way, all of these tips we've given you are rooted in mindfulness. This is the mountain you've just climbed.
Okay.
And so that's why it's structured like that. So the word mindfulness, sometimes, leaders can find intimidating, and we adjust the title to say like, it's a let that shit go workshop, or it's a, get yourself out of your own way workshop, and then, I kind of bring in mindfulness, more subtly. Some leaders don't know how mindfulness can be practical in the workspace, which is so incredibly practical. It, from a leadership perspective, it does drive focus, efficiency, productivity, awareness. And then from a personal perspective, it drives happiness and joy. And so, I get hit up with all kinds of different pushback and challenges around how it's going to land, because we don't want to scare people. We don't want to enforce something on people, but this needs to be addressed. And so I think working in corporate for so long, it kind of helps me navigate how do we better position this if mindfulness is too scary of a word, or meditation, or so, we talk about wellness, or we talk about, different ways to get at it. But when I actually do the workshop, my whole intro is all about mindfulness and how to make it practical. And I make sure that the team knows this is how I'm going to approach it.
That's awesome. That's great. Okay, this is going to be like, I guess, my main last question. So, what future trends do you foresee in the intersection of mindfulness, well-being, and corporate social responsibility?
I see it only growing. I hope it only grows. I hope more and more companies recognize that over 90% of people are stressed out, 25% of people struggle with mental health. And at the end of the day, you don't have robots working for you, you have humans. And the best way to drive retention, the best way to make them feel seen and heard and psychologically safe is to put more and more budget towards this to educate your leaders. So I think the future of it is, from what I've seen, really hopeful. When I started my business, I had 2 clients and I gave myself a year and I proudly had their logos on my website. And I'm like, okay, let's see where this goes. And now I've worked with over 60 companies. So as you can see, there's more and more leaders and companies that are wanting to talk about it. And I just noticed like there's less of me having to convince. Like when I started my company in 2017, it was like, you need wellness, you need mental health. And now I'm getting more pulled of like, hey, we need to talk about mental health. Can you come in and talk?
Mm.
So it's less of that like selling and convincing. It's like this known, it's becoming more and more of a known um, thing. And I think as we also get into equality and, you know, like more women in leadership, I think I'm seeing it more, which is also a problem in itself. I'm doing some work on mental health right now as well, obviously because I lost my dad to suicide. So there's a lot of personal passion there. But yeah, I think there's a lot of hope, especially like as I said, with Gen Z coming in and being unapologetic about like this is what we need. You want us to work for you? This is what we need. Before, I think 20 years ago, it was like we were just happy to have a job. Like we wouldn't ask any questions and took whatever vacation. And the world is changing. It's like I'm not just going to come here and serve you. I need to make sure that my needs are met as well. So I see a lot of progress and change, and I have a lot of hope for where things are going.
I love that so much. I think that most, especially like newly grads, are still kind of with that old mentality. Like, I'm just happy to have a job. I'm so glad I'm here. Yay, I don't need to ask any questions. Just take whatever comes to them. But probably like especially as my friends, graduate and we start to have real jobs, we'll probably see that with it after like maybe 2 to 3 years of experience. That's when they'll finally realize, no, I need to ask questions. I need to make sure that this is the right environment for me. What are they doing for me? I have options. I'm valuable to the workplace. They need to know that.